Right. Okay, so thank you all for joining us. I'm sure there's going to be a few latecomers coming through. I'm delighted to have Dave Ward, who is the director of the nursery and gardens at BethChatto, where he's been since 1983. Everybody who has been to the gravel garden, or all of the garden, knows that it is a place of wonder. But I think tonight we're looking forward to having a sort of behind the scenes look at how it was constructed, and then possibly look at how things are the same in the UK and how they're different to us in the Mediterranean. So Dave, I'll hand over to you. Could you share your screen now?
Bear with me a minute.
Yes.
Okay. He's in the UK. Look at his house, sir. He's got a spider plant.
Barbara, yeah. Okay.
Is that correct?
That is correct. I've got it. It's in.
Yeah, I just got to start off the slideshow, I think. How's that?
That's perfect for me. I'm sure it is for everyone else. Okay. All right. Thank you so much for being with us.
Right. Well, hello, everybody. Just sound check. Can you hear me all? Is everything okay? Right. Well, thank you so much for inviting me to speak to you. Thank you for the introduction, Angela. Saves me introducing myself. Yes, I have been at the BethChatto Gardens almost 40 years. So I've been asked tonight to talk to you about the gravel garden, the drought-resistant garden. It's not quite 40 years old. It's around about 30 now. So I've got quite a few slides to run through. Some I'll go through quite quickly. Others I might linger on. I don't know if people ask me questions as I go along, or...
Oh, sorry, yes, I'm sorry about that. I should have mentioned that normally we have questions and answers at the end. There'll be people posting questions from the chat, and my colleague Yvonne Barton usually help, if there are people who don't want to speak themselves. But when you've finished your presentation, we normally go into gallery mood, and then there are people who come forward, so it's as we work through it. Okay.
Well, I hope you bear with me and I've got to thank my daughter, by the way. I'm sitting in my daughter's bedroom, which is the quietest room in the house. So hence all the house plants. She's a bit of a house plant freak. Anyway, so the gravel garden. Yeah, I do sort of talk locally about the making the gravel garden. So I've sort of pimped it up a bit for this evening. I can't really start without talking about Beth. Just mentioning Beth, she's still, although she passed away in 2018, she's still very much our head gardener, our driving light. This is her at Chelsea, probably in her prime in, I think, 1979, which was our third Chelsea. I came along here in 1983, so I was lucky enough, fortunate enough to do the last 4 Chelseas that Beth done. But it was quite a stressful time for Beth. So eventually we stopped doing Chelsea in 1987, which was quite fortuitous because we were getting quite busy and popular by then. All this sort of publicity that Beth had generated with her unusual way to display her unusual plants. People were coming, and one of our main issues, and many of you may have been here back when this was our car park. This is actually the site of the gravel garden now, but this is pre-gravel garden. This is the car park as we had, and you can imagine, well, you can see what a mess it was basically. And we just didn't have enough space. But it wasn't originally a gravel a car park. Actually, it started a bit earlier as an orchard. Beth's husband Andrew Chatto was a local fruit farmer, And this is one of Beth's daughters standing on the roof of the house, which was built in 1960, overlooking the gravel garden. Just behind her is the orchard trees that came down right to the house. But I'll sort of cover that a bit later on. But I'd just like to sort of really mention, I'm going to say I'm not a geologist, I'm not a scientist, I'm a gardener, but we can take the story right back to 500,000, 450,000 years ago when, I don't know if you can see, because just behind what I can see down the side is Essex. Can you see Essex there? Yeah.
Yes.
So that's where we are, basically, just where that says Essex in the southeast of England. I'm sure you all know where we are. But obviously, this was a long while ago. The glaciers came down, and as they receded, as they melted, they deposited an awful lot of stones, sands, gravels, minerals into this area as they receded. And that's really what makes up the gravel garden as it is now. We call it the gravel garden, not because of the gravel that's on top, but because of what's underneath. If we dig down into the soil 10, 12, 15 feet, we can get out piles of sand and piles of gravel. So that's why we call it the gravel garden. So the story goes back an awful long way. Just out of interest, I did find this nice little snippet of information. So this is the gardens, that little red square up in the top there. And this is the course of the Thames, the former course of the Thames. But as the Thames actually ran directly in front of the garden near enough until it was pushed further south by the sort of glaciers blocking the water. So it's quite a nice little piece of information. I can't really talk. I've really got to talk about rainfall. We all love rainfall, and it's really interesting to know, you know, where you are all around the Mediterranean, all around the world. That's us down in the southeast there, that little red square, and that's the UK's sort of rough average rainfall, varying from 1,500 millimeters, which is 1.5 meters. I can't imagine that, down to 625. So that just gives you an idea. I dare say maybe drier or wetter, I don't know. But we ourselves, we've actually kept rainfall records here since 1953. As mentioned, Beth's husband Andrew was a fruit farmer, so rainfall was quite an important factor in life. So every week, every Monday, the rainfall records are recorded, and they have been here in the same spot ever since 1953. So we've got quite a nice lot of data. And this is sort of something quite interesting. I've split it up on the left-hand side into decades, roughly. So each block is 10 years. So that's millimeters. And, you know, we think it's a bit drier these days in the UK, but just on this specific site, it's telling us otherwise. And that's pretty accurate data. We've used the same method of collecting the rain. It's the same rain gauge that Beth and Andrew had back in the 1950s. And so that gives us an average rainfall since 1953 here of, get this right, 567 millimeters. So let's say 570 millimeters of rain. So if we were a country, this little area of Essex called the Tendring Hundred. If the Tendring Hundred was a country, it would put us around about fifth driest country in Europe. We'd be on a par with places like Cyprus, Malta, Greece, which is a big country, I know, but so quite interesting. I mean, and that's our overriding thing here. We are dry. The soil is dry. The rainfall is the least you're going to get in the UK. So that just puts us into context, really. That said, we have, you know, dry soil, low rainfall, just a few meters away from the gravel garden, the drought-resistant garden that we made. We do have water gardens, so it's a very interesting area for Beth to have gardened in. This is sort of a reverse view. I show you a picture of Beth's daughter standing on roof of the house that's in the background, to the slightly to the right, Beth's old greenhouse slightly to the left. But eventually, as Beth developed the garden, as I said, she came here in 1960. The orchards were grubbed out and the garden was sort of developed around the house. And that's the orchards just beyond the house there, another view, and Beth's, some of Beth's early frames for growing plants there that she was very proud of. She made them very square to the house, made them herself with her husband Andrew, and they sort of spread out from the house to form the nursery as it is today, all very square to the house. Beth was very proud of that. One of the first sort of things that Beth done was to create a windbreak here. We're surrounded by orchards and arable land. We were back in 1960s. So one of the first things Beth done is just a little glimpse of some hedging going in. A Leylandii hedge was planted on the north side of what is now the gravel garden and the east, so it gave us a lot of protection. This is an old slide of Beth and Andrew, just really before the house was built in 1960. As I said, Andrew farmed this land. They knew this land, although they lived the other side of Colchester. Their friend Sir Cedric Morris, and I'm sure many of you know the friendship that Beth and Sir Cedric, who was up at Benton End in Hadley up in Suffolk, not far away, developed. So Cedric rather famously just said to Beth, if you want to grow the range of plants you want, you're going to have to move. Your soil, the other side of Colchester, is just too heavy, it's too sticky. So they knew this land. Beth and Andrew knew the land. They eventually settled back in the old orchard area, and this is them sort of scouting out what we think is an area just leading down to where the house was built in the background there. That's the house as it was built in 1960. Very quite a sort of an interesting house of its time. It was featured in 1 or 2 magazines. Split level house built on a dry bank. So living bedrooms upstairs and some living quarters downstairs. Quite interesting. This is actually the site there. I think that's Andrew. I do apologise for some of the quality of the old pictures. I believe that's Andrew, and this is the sort of the beginnings of Beth's original Mediterranean garden on the dry slope around the house. That was sort of the only area that she had really pre the gravel garden. So this would have been early 1960s really. And that's it, well developed into the sort of 70s, I guess. That might look familiar to some of you, I dare say. The sort of pencil cypress, the conifers, the house sort of disappearing into the background. So it's quite an interesting picture. And Beth and Andrew again made those steps up to the house. Very, very proud of those. That's Beth there, just walking sort of down from those steps over to the water garden. So you can see the proximity of the water garden. The gravel garden is behind that house there. This is sort of rather not a very good slide of the upper area of the Mediterranean garden. Raised beds, very square, just containing all her selection of drought-resistant plants. So really just like to give a little mention for Andrew Chatto. This is a lovely picture took in Corsica, I believe. They were married in 1943. Had 2 daughters. Andrew, as I mentioned, was a fruit farmer by trade, but he probably wasn't the best fruit farmer, he would admit. But his real passion and interest was he studied plants in the wild. They went together all over Europe. he studied books, he translated books from Russian, from Japanese, and this is obviously, you know, all done from books way back in the 30s, 40s. Maybe some of you from the States, anyone from California or?
There are people from California.
California. Andrew actually emigrated with his parents to California in, I think, 1920s when he was a young man, and he sort of rather famously sort of noted that he was interested in natural history, and he noted that all these plants that he was familiar with back in England, plants like ceanothus in the gardens and tree poppies and things like this, were actually growing. He saw them in the wild in California, and that sort of was a little fire of his imagination to try and sort of research and understand where plants came from all over the world. So if anyone gets an opportunity, unfortunately his works were never published, but we did manage to get them all typed up and digitalized, was that word? And there is a section on our website called Andrew Chatto's Archives, which are quite fascinating. One day maybe it'll turn into a book, but he drew some fantastically detailed maps of different areas: Japan, the steppes in Russia, Mediterranean areas, Japan, I believe, all kinds of areas. So Andrew was very much sort of one of Beth's mentor, along with people like Sir Cedric Morris, in understanding where she could grow all these plants that she wanted to grow, what part of the garden, be it sort of hot, dry, or the water garden, or the shade garden. Andrew's knowledge sort of gave her this knowledge, these lists of plants really that she could work with. So he's a very important figure, and he was quite a recluse actually. Andrew, I knew him when I first started. He died in 1999, I believe. He's a few years older than Beth. That's them together at their previous garden, which is the other side of Colchester, Braeswick. Another sort of perhaps more recent influence on Beth, or friendship that Beth developed, was with Christopher Lloyd. And it was on a trip to New Zealand that Beth sort of had this sort of idea. I mean, she'd been trying to think of ways where she could grow all her drought-loving plants away from the house. And a visit to New Zealand, she went on a picnic with Krista. They were on a lecture tour, and they went to a sort of dried up riverbed area. And Beth sort of always had this vision in her head of all these rocks and this flowing area of different sized stones, plants intermittently growing through it. So that was one of the sort of influences for the gravel garden, as well as others. I mean, a visit to Derek Jarman that she went with Christo to down at Dungeness, sort of just gave her these little snippets of an idea, really. And that's I don't know if you can see what's written on Christo's t-shirt there.
I've just written it down. It's great.
Yeah, it's great, isn't it? Yeah, exactly. Unfortunately, obviously, Christo died a few years ago, but they formed a fantastic partnership, really, and friendship, all based around Beth took exception to Christo's dislike of begonias. That we love begonias here, as you might see later on in a few slides. And I think Christo dismissed them rather in his book, The Well-Tempered Garden. So Beth wrote to him, and Christo wrote back and just said, come down for lunch and we'll talk about it. So Beth went down for lunch, and that was the beginning of a very good friendship between the two. Totally contrasting gardens, of course, but shared love of plants, of course. So I'll just sort of talk really about the sort of makings of the gravel garden and sort of practicalities of things. So this was another section, top end of the car park area. You can see the sort of grass going off, and this is often the question we're sort of asked, what can I do with my dried up parched grass in the summer? So this is what we had, plus we had all these cars parking on it. So I'll come back to my lovely car picture. I usually have a bit of a car ident at this point. I'll just point out that's my green Volvo 340 there, just to the right, that I bought off of Beth. And it's served me well. I can't see you all, so I can't communicate with you all individually, so we'll skip past that. But you can see the sort of state of the car park there. So that's what we're dealing with here. The gravel garden is made up of that. That's Beth, and a very well used barrow of soil that we kept for many years to just illustrate what the conditions were like in the gravel garden under that grass. What actually happened was we were able to buy about 3 acres of land that was previously orchard again. What was the other side of the Leylandii hedge that Beth planted. So it freed up the gravel garden from being a car park to becoming part of the garden. So it's just a picture in the sort of, I think it's 2018. We had a sort of consecutive 50 days without any measurable rain. You can see how sort of parched and dry the gravel garden is. So this is the sort of practicalities of what we're dealing with here. I know it's not a patch on what some of you guys experience, but this is what we have here. That's quite an old picture there of Beth. So we started this part of the garden in October, autumn 1991. The car park was sprayed off. We had no problem using Roundup in those days, so it's all sprayed off. And Beth sort of came out, and one of her things is she sort of plays around with some hose pipes, sticks a sort of little fork in one end of a hose pipe, pulls on it, and she can start to play around with curves and beds and what Beth always called straight curves. She could sort of pull on that hose pipe and get some really nice curves, much more easy than trying to sort of feed a rope around or canes or anything like that. So Beth sort of, there's still a technique that we use today, even if it's just getting the curves back on some established borders. So on this scale, the gravel garden itself is around about, it's hard to tell really, it's an acre plus. It's not too large, acre and a half probably. On that scale, we were able to get a tractor in and start to prepare the soil. So this is probably sort of heading into November time. And the implement that Beth is looking at there is it's called a subsoiler, which is an L-shaped piece of metal that basically goes deep into the soil. The more you drag it through, breaks up that pan. Obviously, all those cars on there for so many years had really compacted the soil. So Beth there is looking to see how deep that subsoiler is going. She was very keen. Deep soil preparation. I mean, I'll come on to a bit later, but we're often known for this term right plant, right place, which Beth certainly didn't invent. That she didn't coin that phrase, but she certainly took it forward and moved it on a bit, I think. But soil preparation is really key to what we do here as well. So no matter what the soil is, be it damp, dry, shady, sunny, whatever, deep soil preparation is key to giving the plants a good start. And I'll show a few more things on a more sort of smaller level. So it looks pretty, there's got a nice depth of soil there, but it's it's November, so it looks quite moist there. So sort of moving through the winter, and Beth had sorted out where these beds were going to go. Still see the hose pipes in place there. So we started to sort of think, what will we use to improve the soil? So, we had to really improve this very poor, stony, gravelly soil if we wanted to give the plants a good start. So we spread on as much homemade compost as we could produce, and we brought in quite a lot of spent mushroom compost, which we still use today. We're very keen. It's I guess it's used all around the world, but it's basically a very well rotted manure, straw, bit of lime, but it's a very clean material. It doesn't contain any weed seeds. So that's what we use, and that's what's happening here. On a sort of smaller scale, obviously, this is a bit later, obviously, when the gravel garden was made. This is a bit of repair planting that we were doing, but much the same sort of theory, really. We've had to take away a bit of soil there to get rid of lots of bulbs and roots. That's what we're dealing with. This is sort of 15 years later, really. All that goodness that we added to the soil has disappeared. All that organic matter has been used. Now it's time to really repair it, and we can't just plant into that. Beth would always say it's no good giving plants the poorest you have. You've got to give them the best you can offer. So that's what's happening here. It's all forked over, nice deep soil preparation. That's not a very good picture. I'm sorry about that. That's supposed to be a picture of a worm and some organic matter. I didn't quite know what happened there. I think I chose the wrong picture. But so lots of organic matter being added. I'm sorry. And then when the soil is actually ready for plants. So this process we go through from October till March. So by March, it's March, April time, it's planting time. One thing we're very keen on is to make sure the plants are really moist when we plant them. So we make sure we soak every single plant in a bucket of water till it stops bubbling, basically, and then we lay them out. And that's just, yeah, there we go, sort of bit of prepared soil. Plants been planted in the spring. Teasing the roots back, that's important just in case anything's a little bit root bound. And then watering in. This is the only, so when Beth decided to make the gravel garden, obviously we had this dry soil, low rainfall, and then Beth threw into the mix that we probably wouldn't water these plants. Let's see how they survive without actually being watered, apart from what falls from the sky. So fair enough, let's go with it. So this is where plant choice is really critical, where we come back to Andrew's research, giving Beth that information of which plants, you know, should be able to survive this kind of climate. It's quite harsh climate here. But we do water them in when we plant them, but we don't just sort of sprinkle a bit of water on them. We really puddle them in, take the rose off the watering can or the hose pipe, and a little depression around the plant so the water doesn't flow away, and it just settles into the root. And that's the only watering these plants have ever had, or they ever get. So the sort of other thing the finishing thing really is a mulch. Obviously mulch is a material that's used for keeping the weeds down and keeping the moisture in. We chose to use gravel. It just seemed to suit. This is, you know, if we use bark for us as a mulch for shadier areas, damper areas perhaps. So it's the sort of aesthetics of it you're looking at now, as well as the practicalities. Gravel just seems to shout to us hot dry. So gravel it was. A good inch, maybe 2 inches of this gravel, which is, I think it's about 12 millimeter down gravel, local gravel. As I say, we could dig down where we're surrounded by gravel pits here. This is our local stone, if you like, flints and gravels. So that's myself and Beth. She's probably telling me I've done something wrong or whatever. So just a couple of things there. I mean, Beth, we would never work to a plan. Beth never worked to a plan. We would bring out trolleys of plants. She would have lists of plants. She would write down lists of plants on the back of pieces of cardboard. She would cut cardboard out and have these cardboard sheets, much more practical than paper sheets. They wouldn't blow away. And really we'd work from that. She'd have little ideas, maybe a combination of 2 or 3 plants together that she'd seen or thought of or read about or had tried before. And then it's just done by eye, really. Beth would just lay the plants out. And that's how it was done. It was any plans were made afterwards, not before. And we still, that's kind of the way we still work in the gardens. I will just say I'm not the head gardener. We have a head gardener who's been with us for 20 years now, also, who started off as a student here, came over 20 years ago and is now our garden manager, head gardener. But we still do the same processes, the same kind of planting. Yeah, so that's what's happening there. And that's just sort of shortly after the gravel garden was planted, probably a year after, really. All the paths are freshly gravelled, so there's no edges to the borders, to the beds. There's no everything. There's no membrane, you know, to stop seeding. We want things to seed, to mingle, to get quite a naturalistic look. It's still quite blocky there because things haven't started to seed around. And we have learned over the years that if we're not careful, you know, things like, let's say, Verbena bonariensis or verbascums or 1 or 2 annuals can seed around a bit too much. So we have learned an awful lot of things, and we've learned some plants, you know, the boundaries that we set, the plants that we thought would grow, they kind of survived a year or 2 with all that goodness in the soil that we put in. But when we came to a really dry summer, which we didn't actually encounter until 1996, so 3 or 4 years after the gravel garden was planted in the spring of 92, we had the first real test, and that really sorted out things that were not, we're on the borderline, really. So plants for us that we failed with were things like Achilleas, Anthemus, some of the green ones, not the grey ones, the green ones, Niphofias, that sort of thing, that just, it was just too dry. You know, again, Christopher Lloyd on one of his visits could never really understand why Beth was letting her plants die. He just couldn't really grasp it. He just couldn't understand why we weren't watering them. But we stuck on in there. It was very close at one point. And of course it rains in this country eventually. I think that 50-day board was probably the most we've ever had, longest period without any rain. And so we've learned over the years where the boundaries are, really. That's really the gravel garden, much the same sort of view, really. It's a little while, it's not quite up to date. But that's probably the gravel garden, probably looking at its best in about May time, early June perhaps, when all the iris and the poppies and things are in flower. I will just, sort of hidden behind the gallery here, but you can see a big eucalyptus off to the right-hand side. That is probably, I mean, bearing in mind it's 30 years old, that tree now. It's approaching about 80 feet tall now. Not a tree we would recommend to anyone to plant in their own garden or anywhere near a house especially, but I remember planting that tree with Beth when the gravel garden was, when we were planting, and she couldn't quite decide where to put it, but it was probably about 1 foot tall. She was never very keen to plant specimen trees, always wanted to plant small trees so they could get their roots in themselves rather than struggle out of a sort of pot bound. So again, that's just a emphasis about the rainfall there. That means a great deal to you guys, but I'm afraid I'm a bit of the generation where I'm still on inches and millimeters. But we're quite keen to inform the customers. You know, we do get people come along to the gravel garden and say, oh, it looks a bit dry and a bit, you know, but it's the whole point of it being there. All these plants are planted to survive dry conditions, you know, in our part of the world. They might not look at their best during those dry periods. Their mechanism is to curl up or to defoliate, but that's what they're doing. They're surviving until the rains come, and as I say, it rains pretty often in this country. So there's 2018 looking pretty dry there. And that's probably the driest it's ever looked. That was about August, early September 2018. So you can see how parched, and I guess many of you might be familiar with this sort of, well, you are, I know, the Mediterranean sort of pattern of growth. It's all full of colour and growth in the spring, sort of February, March, April. That's when I've been to the Mediterranean to look at plants. Hillsides are covered, but come summer, all the plants are in survival mode, and there's not a great deal of colour. But just think under there's lots of bulbs, you know, which are the best drought-resistant plants. You know, they're dormant in the summer, so you know, we know it changes. And that's it. Probably in a more normal summer, sort of roughly the same view, really. You know, grasses, all the sort of clouds of Bupleurum falcatum, that acid green running through, mullions, verbascums. They're plants that we must be careful they don't seed around too much. So the gravel garden has changed greatly over the years. The paths have narrowed. Everything ebbs and flows. As I say, there is no edges to the borders, so and that's how we want it. We want things to sort of gel into each other. Everything is permanently planted. We don't bed anything out apart from maybe one or two agaves if we have too many. But everything is permanently planted. Temperature-wise, apart from one or two exceptions, if it goes down to below -5, that's cold. Celsius, that's cold. It's been down, apart from one very exceptional evening when it went down to -15 or so. Anything down to -8, -9 is very, very cold for us. We have had some winters where we've barely had a frost. It's been -2, -3. We're not right on the coast, but we're probably 8 to 10 miles inland. But that's sort of looking north, and you can see the hedge on the east side. Vital for anyone who lives on the east coast of England to have some protection against the east wind. They're the cold winds. So just go through a quick cycle of what it looks like. There's a couple of agaves there bedded out. We use them. They're not hardy. We have to bring them in the winter. Occasionally we've left one out. It just depends what it's like in the winter. So we use them as a sort of just, all these plants are very fussy. There's lots of fussy foliage. There's no big foliage in the gravel garden. So it's quite useful to have a spiky sort of plant to take just to draw the eye somewhat. So this is late summer, probably October, coming into October. You know, so much interest there, so many textures, form, shape, very few flowers. A few flowers that you could take away. It wouldn't really distract from the look of that, really. So we can't grow, you know, plants like roses obviously are out, it's too dry. So we're using plants like cistus. What else have we got there? Gauras, helichrysum. So Beth would have her bun-shaped plant. So the helichrysum in the middle there, cistus, bolottas, lavenders, those types of plant. And then she would use vertical plants. So some of the grasses you can see there, iris foliage, a bit of perovskea just in the center left. So they're the sort of vertical plants that are coming up amongst the bun-shaped plants. It's just the grass and culture, because bulbs are very important. I always think the year really starts, not for me in the spring, it starts in the autumn. So these are colchicums just underplanted under Stipa gigantea. This is a sort of a late autumn, early winter shot. We leave as much growth up as possible. Sedums in the front there, Sedum herbstrophoida, Stipa calamagrostis in the middle of the grass, Stipa calamagrostis calforsta, the taller one at the back there. And this is a trend that sort of changed a bit. When I first went, the garden would be tidied up a lot more than it is now. These days we tend to leave things throughout the garden, gravel garden, water garden, wherever, you know, for the sort of insect value, etc. And so yeah, so that's sort of first frosts really in the gravel garden, the hoarfrost. So you can see the value of leaving things up as much as possible. Snow, nice snow picture. That's our tea room in the distance there. Snow's never the easiest thing. It's sort of blanket covers, and you don't always get the best shots. But snow, we do get snowfall. Obviously, we had a famous thing called the Beast from the East a few years ago, which gave us very cold, blizzard-like temperatures on the East Coast. But it's not an annual occurrence, snow. In fact, I think it was one of Beth's books, the photographer Stephen Worcester, he just could not get a snow picture. He spent about 3 or 4 years taking pictures, and it just didn't snow for him to get some pictures. There's one there. So begonias, I always give a shout out for begonias. Just fantastic plants in the winter, green in the summer, but they're one of the few plants that we can grow that give us a bolder leaf. Everything else in the gravel garden tends to be quite fussy, but begonias, this one's called Almond Glocken, are just such a focal point in the winter. It's just a shame people don't visit gardens so much in the winter. Oh, there's another begonia, Euphorbia. So this is just sort of coming around into the spring. Lovely grass there called, off to the right there, and Pelodesmos Moritanicus, which is a North African grass. One of the plants that wasn't originally planted in the gravel garden, something that we introduced a bit later, but it is a fantastic grass. It just stays in flower from sort of June, when its fresh flowers come, stands all the way through the summer, through the winter, until we cut those old flowers off in the probably about February, March, when we have a bit of a tidy up.
Sorry, what was the name?
And Pelodesmos Moritanicus. I can't give you a common name, but Pelodesmos.
Thank you. And somebody was actually asking about summer temperature on the chat. So
yes, sure, summer temperature. Well, I mean, you know, us Brits, we flag if it goes above 25 Celsius. It's very hot if it goes above 30. We don't actually keep temperature records, so we never have done that. The highest temperature's ever been here, it's going to go up to sort of maybe 36, 37. But, you know, we're flagging by then.
Generally,
summer temperature is in the 20s, and then when it gets into the 30s, it's considered a heat wave. If that helps.
Okay.
Yeah. Sort of coming around in the spring. So this term right plant, right place is often, you know, it's used obviously for the conditions of plants, and Beth could never understand it. It was quite common sense to her. You just chose the plants. You know, if a plant liked to hot, dry, sunny spot, you gave it a hot, dry, sunny spot. Or if you had a damp, wet spot, you chose plants that grow in a damp, wet spot. It was just common sense. But it's amazing how many people just want to buy a plant because they like it and then try and find the conditions for it. And we're all probably guilty of that to some degree, but that's what we're all about here, choosing the right plant for all the conditions that we have. And we have pretty well every condition you can get here: clay, damp, everything. But also sort of plant choice. We could easily grow snowdrops in the gravel garden. But for us, a snowdrop is a woodland plant. It's a more sort of shade loving plant. We prefer to grow things that associate more with sunnier, open aspects. So things like scillas, well, chinodoxas are scillas now, but scillas, species tulips, of course. We don't grow sort of bedding tulips, crocus, that kind of thing. Alliums, of course, later on in the season. So all sort of more sun-loving bulbs. This is a lovely little combination of a scilla along with a New Zealand plant called Libertia peregrinans, which is a good example of how a plant can just, it's this Libertia, this clump of Libertia survived for 20 plus years. And then all of a sudden, one year, I think it was 2018, just killed it completely. It was too dry. And that's another factor that comes into it, because age of plants often, you don't think of the age of plants, how that can affect their drought resistance. So I think this clump was just too old. We've replanted it and it's fine. Really interesting. Begonias again, I'll do better on about begonias, but this is a lovely one called Beethoven. So coming more now into sort of April time. A lovely dwarf Russian almond at the back there, Prunus tenella, and a helichrysum, grey leaves helichrysum. That's a lovely begonia. If I can enthuse anyone about begonias, people often stick them in shady corners. They grow, but they don't flower that well, and you don't get that good a colour in the leaves. So this one's a fantastic one, Beethoven. Starts out white, fades to pale pink. Put them in the sun, full sun, exposed to as much wind and sun, and they'll give you good autumn colour and good flower. Just a couple of some pulsatilis, native plants of this country, pasque flower, and Grecian windflowers, I know those as, anemone fulgens. I'll just rattle through a few slides here. This Euphorbias, of course, are a mainstay of the garden. I know I've seen them in the Mediterranean on the hillsides. This is Euphorbia, Gerasius, Wolfenia, and a good old Amelanchier in flower at the back there. Very tough flowering small tree. And a nice yucca, just gives us that focal point there. Just sort of coming a bit more into sort of May time, Euphorbias again, sort of start of a flowering spike in the foreground of the Bascum, and spikes of Asphodylus albus, which is a Mediterranean plant there. Nice sort of combination there. So this we've just actually re-released a book called The Green Tapestry, and I love that title because I think it really sort of just explains in 3 words. And Beth's planting, she would always make this kind of tapestry of plants. Ground cover plants, very important. And there's a lovely time here. Time's longicornis, which is early flowering time. Most times flower for us in midsummer. This is an April flowering time. Bees love it, absolutely love it. That's a lovely layered planting there. The Bascum coming up there. See how important these verticals are. The Verbascum just shooting up, self-sown seedling. We wouldn't have planted that. It's just put itself there. I think I can see a few alliums and things in the back there, just coming up all amongst these lower bun-shaped plants. Poppies, of course, are important. Unfortunately, over the years, we and many other gardens in this country, and I believe abroad in Europe, have lost a lot of their oriental poppies. So we don't have as many as we used to have. The plant on the left-hand side is, depending which books you read, it's either Nectaroscordon bulgaricum or Allium dioscorides, but a lovely, unusual allium relative, nodding flowers. And then as those flowers come into seed, turn into seed, they'll go up, turn upright, and they look like sort of castle turrets. Good old alliums in the back there. Iris, of course, so we're sort of into late May, early June. This is Iris Jane Phillips, very common iris. So any iris just gives you that lovely foliage, fleeting flower, but it's the foliage really that Beth was interested in. The cloud of white in the front there is a little annual. We do have quite a few annuals in the gravel garden, self-sowing hardy annuals. This is Omphaloides linifolia, navel wart, that's a common name. That's more nice sort of full picture of the gravel garden in. Yeah, so you see how important those iris are, just given that vertical amongst all those low bun-shaped plants. It's just an interesting picture. I mentioned species tulips. Most of them sort of flower April time, early May. But this one is the latest of the tulips. I think it's Turkish, Tulipa sprengeri. This would be early June, and it took us many years to get these tulips to seed around. They sort of take years, and you don't really notice them because they don't flower. They take maybe 4 or 5 years to build up to a flowering size bulb. But yeah, just patience, I guess. So Tulipa sprengeri. Just nice dreamy picture of some alliums there. So some will come into May, June time. Again, you see that's that lovely grass and Pelodesmos Moritanicus that's in full flower there. People are often a bit frightened of grasses, afraid that they're going to spread or seed. We're quite honest about a grass. And Beth, this is a lovely one. It just stays put. It just forms a lovely clump. And Beth would use grasses very sparingly. We don't mass plant grasses. We tend to plant them, the bigger grasses, individually, so you can see the shape and the form of the grass. Sorry, my dog's barking in the background for some reason. And the begonia there in the front, and how important those begonias are. They're green. Everybody just walks past them in the summer, don't really notice them. They're not flowering. They flower back in April, but they're just such an important part of the overall scheme. Some of you might recognise gladioli, byzantinus, Gladiolus byzantinus. Again, we have to be careful with some of these plants that they don't overseed. Which is one of the gardens are very frightened of plants that overseed. Just a nice little picture there of an annual poppy. Just a nice connection back to Sir Cedric Morris. I briefly mentioned Beth's connection with Sir Cedric. He sort of selected a range of lovely pastel shaded poppies from our native field poppy, scarlet field poppy, that sometimes goes under the name of Cedric's poppy or mother of pearl poppies. So these are the kind of annuals that seed around in the gravel garden. Lovely pastel shades. I mentioned we can't grow roses, so we grow plants like cistus. This is Cistus ladanifer. Another sort of one of Beth's little sayings, she had many, is that we don't use the hose pipe in the gravel garden. We don't water, but we do use the secateurs. So a lot of pruning goes on after flowering. So plants like cistus, after they've flowered, which is usually sort of May, early June, they will then get pruned in midsummer just to take away some stress from the plant, just to reduce the foliage really. Plants like, say, catmints that are quite common, after they've flowered, cut them back hard to the ground, especially if it's going to be dry or is dry. Or sometimes if it's moist summer, we might just cut them back halfway, but it just reduces the stress on the plants. Merrist is something that is a bit of a borderline plant. This is Foxtail Lilies, Merrist. Beth constantly tried to plant them without a great deal of success. We found one or two that do survive. This is Cleopatra, I believe. So we do struggle with a few plants. It's just a nice picture looking the other way. Again, that lovely grass in the middle there. I can't speak more highly of it than Pelodesmos. Spanish broom, the yellow off to the right there. Phlomis, good old Phlomis russelliana in the foreground, which has actually faded away a bit through the recent dry summers. Just some backlit Stipa gigantea, and then in the foreground is a plant that wasn't originally introduced to the gravel garden until later. This is Stipa barbata, but really lovely grass, sort of just waves in the slightest of the winds. That's the garden's used a lot for nursery. Obviously, Beth developed the nursery at the same time as the garden. Back in the nursery was first registered as unusual plants back in 1967. So the nursery sort of financed the garden to some degree. So Beth, when she passed away, she was, many of the sort of write-ups, many of them called her a garden designer, and she wouldn't have been too pleased about being called a garden designer, but many of them called her a nursery woman, and she was a very good nursery woman. Learned from Cedric, and she learned, she taught herself, she learned from experience. I think that's very important. Luckily, she passed a lot of those skills on to myself and other members of staff. And Emily, the girl on the call her girl, she's getting on a bit now, but she's been with us since she was a youngster. They're collecting the seed of the Stipa barbata, which we must be very quick because it has a tendency to blow away, and each individual seed, awn of seed, will spiral its way into the ground as soon as it touches the ground. So that they're on it every day. Just another nice full picture of the gravel garden. I just included that one. Obviously, there's a begonia again in the foreground, but the tree in the background, I guess some of you might be familiar with Mount Etna broom, Genista aitnensis, in full flower. Fantastic tree for this kind of planting. It doesn't cast too much shade. It's scented. It's evergreen, and it stands as dry as a bone. Just wants, it's quite slow growing initially. Wants a bit of a help up. Just interestingly, the plant in front of that grey sort of shrub in the middle, Atropex halimus, Russian purslane, probably the shrub that we prune the most. We probably prune that about 3 times a year. It just keeps growing, and we have to keep it in bounds a bit. Otherwise, it just grows and grows and grows. Another picture looking the same way there. That's kind of a typical summer picture. If we haven't had droughts, that's what it looks like in sort of August time, I guess, if it's not too dry. August, maybe early September. And then other plants sort of late in the season now, Agapanthus, they grow very well. We don't protect them at all. Just useful to have a blue at that time of year. I think this one's called Evening Star. And really coming full cycle back to good old Verbena bonariensis, sedum, and the Bascom. I've almost come to the end. Just a little word about what's happening now, or just in recent past. We were very kindly invited to recreate the gravel garden at Hampton Court Flower Show in 2019. So we couldn't really, the opportunity not that we couldn't really refuse. So we rocked up one day, and this is what we were faced with. They very kindly let us dig the soil over, or had it dug over for us, which we insisted on. So we sort of recreated the gravel garden at Hampton Court. It took us a couple of weeks to plant. We insisted on planting it rather than staging it, if you understand what I mean. We actually planted the plants in the soil to make it more realistic, and it was very well received. This was when's Hampton Court? It's around about the middle of July, isn't it? It seems so long ago now. It's pre-COVID. And obviously it was an RHS sponsored garden, so it got really good coverage. That's Gardens World, Joe Swift and Joe Wiley presenters. Very popular with the public, and I hope they appreciated it. It was the hottest 2 weeks we've ever had. It really was. But I've almost come to the end. If you don't want to go to all that effort, a few pots and a few succulents just arranged, perhaps just find yourself a little robin or little bird to enhance the scene, and that's a nice little gravel garden made. So that's the Lazy Gardens version. I will just mention we do have an educational trust attached to the gardens that we started up about 5 years ago. So we do run a lot of our courses through and sort of educational things through the trust, which allows us to actually run the business to get on. We have dedicated teachers and lecturers, etc. So just really leading on to the fact that we asked a lot of sort of people, you know, would they be a patron to the trust? And without exception, every one of them just instantly said yes, which just goes to show, I think, the standing Beth and the respect that she had within the industry and with gardening circles. So there's Alan with his nice pink jumper on, and Beth in the gravel garden there. By the way, just out of interest, the tree to the yew tree to the left there, not the big one in the background, worried us so much that eventually we took it out, and it's a great example of right plant, right place. It gave Beth that vertical, but we were constantly sort of tying it in, keeping it upright, and it just ended up looking like a person standing there. So we dug it out basically. So it's good, just a good example of, you know, something that I hope you appreciate. The slides have shown you. The garden is very, it's a very quiet garden. There's no, I'd like to say Christo's garden, which is very contrasting, lots of bright colours, contrasting colours. It's a very pastel garden, and anything that stands out in the garden that draws your eye, unnaturally, we do question, we do look at, for whatever reason. Just more recent developments. I'm personally quite keen on this sort of sand planting, and you know, we traditionally sort of try to improve the soil, but I know that many people around the world are sort of experimenting with planting into sand. This was just an opportunity that we had, an area behind the gravel garden, to plant. We had just had a pile of sand that we got out from the building we were building, spread it over about a foot thick on top of the bank, which is basically old gravel garden soil, and water the plants once, carefully chosen plants, and see what happens. So this was this year in June, planted it quite late. We've donated this lovely bee post, which is old green heartwood. And the plants have, without fail, we didn't lose one plant. They have responded pretty well. Obviously nothing like you just see on the top there, the plants that were planted into actual prepared soil, but it's been an interesting experiment. So plants like Zauschneria, lots of Teucriums, Santolinas, some of the Salvias, various grasses we've chosen. There is actually I did write a blog on it and put it on our website if anyone's interested, on the sandbank. It gives a whole list of the plants that we used. That's just really just an overall view of gardens today, and just pre the gravel garden. You can see in 1989, one to the right, the gravel garden, the car park, and the fact that we were surrounded by orchards back in those days. Then you go to present day. That was took a couple of days ago with a drone. I guess the other one was a plane. Same, roughly the same view. All the orchards now have gone in this whole area now, and you can see the gravel garden there. So quite an interesting sort of picture.
Okay.
And that's just a final picture of Beth. I can't really finish without coming back to Beth. This is probably one of the last pictures I remember having been taken of her in the garden. And I love that picture. She's just pruning away that Atriplex that we prune 3 times a year, and she's hacking away at it. But I just like the look on her face there. She's just in her element there. So I wouldn't be here speaking to you if it wasn't for Beth. So thank you very much. Thank you. That's my persentation.
Okay. Well, thank you.
I usually put the lights on now and see who's awake.
Yeah. Okay. So
thank you.
If you perhaps
stop share, or
and we'll go into gallery mood so you can actually see your audience.
Oh, crikey. Oh, hello.
Maybe it wasn't better. Maybe it was better not to see them. I don't know. It must be hard actually keeping going. That was a very, very thorough and step-by-step introduction. Your love of that iconic lady comes through. There were lots of questions coming through on the chat, so I think we, in the interest of time, let's address those. Yvonne, perhaps would you like to?
Yes. First of all, I mean, absolutely fascinating and wonderful. It's I don't know about everybody else, but the dry garden books that BethChatto wrote were my first point of inspiration for gardening in our central Italian climate. So, you know, I'm utterly indebted, and I just wish I'd been able to go there and meet her. Anyway, lots of people are asking detailed questions simply because there's so much to think about that we couldn't really keep up.
Right, okay, sorry.
So please excuse us if we ask questions that you think, well, I've already told you that. For example, I mean, the tall tree with yellow flowers, which didn't cast a shade, quite near the end of your talk.
Yeah,
Was it a mimosa of some sort?
No, that's we can grow mimosa in this country. There's a lovely one in the village actually. So no, this was Genista aitnensis, the Mount Etna broom. Mount Etna broom from Mount Etna, Sicily. Okay. Genista aitnensis.
Thank you. Now, there were a few plants that you said you couldn't grow, and this to us is quite interesting because we all feel terrible failure when we can't grow these things. So, for example, the fact that the great BethChatto could not grow Foxtail Lily, I just thought, yes, hooray! So I can't.
Well, we can grow it elsewhere in the garden, just not in the gravel garden.
Right, but I mean, many of us on this call, we only have the equivalent of the gravel garden, you know, in our conditions. So. Why do you think this is? You said that Euphorbias didn't grow, Foxtail Lilies don't grow. What is it that stops them, do you think? What's wrong?
basically the gravel garden's just too dry for them. I mean, Eremurus are plants, they grow really fantastically. I mean, why Beth wanted to grow them is because at Hyde Hall, which is not that far away, 40 miles, no, 30, 40 miles down the road, on their heavy clay soil, and they have a very well-known gravel garden, different from ours because it's been created. I mean, the soil's been added, and I don't think they actually grow in the gravel garden, but they grow in the rose garden. They can grow fantastic roses, clay soil, and Beth just saw them there, and she always wanted to grow Eremurus. And yeah, I guess at the time the gravel garden was the sort of newest area, lots of concentration going on it, but it was just too dry. We struggled, tried to put them on piles of sort of, better prepared soil. Didn't work. So we found somewhere else. We found somewhere, we do have quite a lot of, so under our sands and gravels is London clay. And in certain areas of the garden, it has been spread from when the farmers' reservoirs were dug. So we do have areas of clay which seem to suit Eremurus better. Yeah, and what's the other plants you said? Well, I think Euphorbias, of course. I don't know why, they're just too dry. It's just too dry. I mean, these plants, some of these plants just want moisture in the summer, and I guess.
No, very interestingly, you did say that oriental poppies were not.
Well, they've died out from a disease. So basically, we had a fantastic selection. Beth would regularly go over to Germany to Gruffen von Zeppelin's nursery in Bavaria, Black Forest, just off Black Forest. And she brought back a lovely selection of oriental poppies. But over the years, we used to be able to propagate them easily from root cuttings, grow them in the garden, no problem, real feature. But in more recent years, they have a disease, a form of downy mildew, I believe, which has made the propagation of named cultivars almost impossible. They just fade away.
Oh, how sad.
And I think some of the I think I can't remember the name, Sandy Worth, the national collection holder, just lost all the name varieties, and yeah.
Oh, how shocking.
It's, yeah, I mean, I'm sure, I mean, we do still have some oriental poppies, many gardens do, I know, but we just can't grow the varieties we used to. Fortunately.
Now, a lot of people are also asking us about the maintenance of the garden, how much time you take, because, for example, you said you don't like them to set seed too much. And so what are we talking about? Are we just meaning, a little bit of a trim in July or a big cut? No.
It might look quite sort of, natural, get on with itself sort of thing. But the gardeners of which we have, let's get this right, 3 full-time, 2 part-time, and we do have trainees, etc., and sort of interns sometimes. They probably spend on average maybe a week, a month in the season as such, in the gravel garden. So they're not weeding as such, and they're sort of, they're weeding out. They're not weeding, say, weeds that we know of, meadowgrass or groundsel or whatever. They're selecting out how many Verbena bonariensis to leave if there's lots of seedlings, how many verbascums, which ones. They're keeping the begonias quite tidy because they do get quite, the leaves die back, and so they sort of tidy them up. They're deadheading a lot. They're pruning in the summer, as I mentioned. They're not watering, they're pruning. In the winter, this time of year, at the very back of the gravel garden, after we've had a period of rain, we'll be mulching. So we won't be using gravel, we'll be using straw at the back there. So, there is a lot of editing that goes on in the gravel garden, but there's no grass to cut.
I mean, it's a public garden, isn't it? I mean,
it's our front garden. Yeah, it's yeah, I think in Beth, I will mention, Beth wrote a book on the gravel garden in 2000, I think it was published. So she had a good, 10 years experience of gardening when she was writing the book in the gravel garden. And there are some hourly figures in that book, which I haven't got to hand, unfortunately, that will give you detailed information of maintenance, etc. But things have changed. I mean, Beth often said when it was young, it was a sort of you had to nurture it. Then it became an unruly teenager. And then it's sort of now. I was actually
going to ask, when do you decide? You mentioned that you were, sorry for butting in, but you do have to go and renovate.
Yes, we do.
What stage is it? Because it's just expanded too much. What's that process? When does it happen?
We kind of like to do certain areas around the garden, so we try and identify an area in the gravel garden, in the water garden, the wood garden each year to try and have a maintenance, so we don't concentrate on one area. Every area gets a certain amount of renewal. So we'd like to probably do it more often. So we'll identify an area, say between that clump of begonias and that shrub. We could do better there. The plants are a bit tired. So that's how we sort of decide. And of course, in the gravel garden, we can work on it any time of the winter, whereas other areas that we have to access across the grass or around the water, if it's very wet, we can't really get on. So the gravel garden's quite a good area to work on. And sometimes it depends. Some things fall into our hands unexpectedly. We had a very big conifer taken down at the top of the gravel garden, which opened a huge area up above that sandbank area that I show you. So that was developed last year, and it looked really good this year. So,
Okay. Are there any more questions from the chat? Comment?
One person was just asking again, could you just explain how big the gravel is, the diameter?
I think it's 12 millimeter down. So by that means sort of nothing bigger than 12 millimeter. But that's what we've used. It just happens to be. I always tell people you can use what you want, really.
No, I think it's better to be a little about the top of that scale, because I think when it's smaller, it just tends to sort of. It depends if you've obviously laid
membrane,
but you said that you didn't.
We haven't. No. The reason we chose that size, the bigger the stone is, the more you have to have of it to actually hide up the soil underneath, if you see what I mean. It has to be quite a deep, big pebbles sort of thing. You put 3 big pebbles on top, whereas small stone sort of interlocks, and it is not rounded, it's sharp. It's sharper gravel, not rounded. So it interlocks a lot better. So there was a bit of a thought process that went into it. I remember going with Beth to some local gravel pits, and that's the easiest way. Go to the local builders merchants and things and actually choose what you want, what colour, what grade, what size. But we're very fortunate, as I say, to have that as a local material.
How much does what do you buy it in? Do you buy 100 kilos? What do you buy? How much does it cost? Because it is
good question. Well, we actually go over to our local pit and pick it up in a tractor, so we don't buy it by the dumpy bag full, which we would normally do. We'd buy it by the cubic meter. We go over, and they just weigh it on the. Most of these things is transport cost. The actual cost of the material is very little.
Interesting. Here in Italy, we have trouble getting gravel that is naturally formed. You can easily buy stone that has been crushed, so it's angular.
Yes, yeah.
And it's quite unpleasant to look at. It's sort of a rather nasty grey. But the kind of nicely colour-ranged, rounded pebbles that you're talking about, I know somebody who can get it for me, but he won't reveal his sources.
Right, okay.
You could get Class A drunks more easily, I think. But a question is coming in from our botanic expert, asking, could you tell us again the name of that cultivar of the red Virginia? The one you're
Abendglocken, evening bells, Abendglocken. Not to be fused with Abendglut, Abendglocken. It's the best begonia. It's a medium-sized begonia. It's not a sort of a big sprawly one. It has quite sort of almost sort of crinkly leaves in the winter. Has really quite deep cerise pink flowers in the spring, and totally green in the but you must plant it in full sun. Don't put them in the shade. You won't get the colour in the leaves. So exposed, full sun, and you'll get fantastic winter colour.
And somebody would like, if you wouldn't mind, that lovely wavy grass that was very slender. The stiper, was it capillata?
Stiper barbata.
Yeah.
Stiper barbata.
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 Thank you. Barbata. Thank you very much.
Somebody else was speaking? Somebody else was speaking?
Yes, I'd like to, I just wanted to say I went to the gardens in 1991, 92, and I saw all those pipes all being laid out on the car
wonderful.
park. It
Lovely.
was quite interesting. It was lovely seeing the photos that you'd got.
Yes, yeah, it was, unfortunately I was always the one tasked with taking pictures, so gardening and cameras don't always go together. So,
no, it definitely looked like that. All those pipes all around the place. It was amazing to see the beginnings of the garden. And then I went about 5 or 6 years later, and it was amazing, the difference, incredible.
Yeah. I mean, it was. I very often show a video that was taken. Obviously, Zoom doesn't really take videos very well, but it's amazing to look at. And Beth did plant a lot of what we would call sort of half-hardy plants out in the gravel garden to begin with, just to fill it out a bit. But she soon stopped that as the plants grew. No, it did look very, very lush in the early days with all that organic matter. It wasn't surprising. And the bit of planting we've done this year, as I said, exactly the same. Good soil preparation. We know what plants to choose now. We had a relatively kind summer. It hasn't been that dry. So it looks really good, yeah.
Please, Mayor. Oh, hello. Yeah. Oh, Gerard, hello again.
Hello.
After you.
George, go first, George. You need to unmute yourself, George.
Thank you, Angela. David, thank you very much for that really marvelous talk. I'm wondering if you'd care to say anything about how or to what degree or whatever Beth enjoyed her garden.
Beth lived and breathed her garden. I mean, she lived right in the middle of it. And even though, it was open to the public, well, it wasn't open weekend, probably was Saturdays then, but, she loved sharing her garden. I think at times she could have enjoyed it more, and she certainly enjoyed it as she got older, but there was always something to see, to do. She was always, she'd always be making lists of jobs. I mentioned those cardboard lists of plants that she would give us. She would also do job lists on those cardboard. So you'd come in on a Monday and get a shout to go down and see Beth, and you'd get a list of jobs. So I think I always felt a bit for her, because I think the garden was a constant, I wouldn't say worry as such, but it was her garden, her responsibility, I guess.
I'm gonna draw to a close. I'm sorry if there are outstanding questions, because I think it's never happened, but I'm concerned that Zoom it might cut us out. I put an hour and a half in when I set up the meeting, which I won't do again. I'm not sure, you know, as I say, if it will just blank us all out. So I wanted everybody to have a chance to say thank you, David, to say, you know, Happy Christmas. And I would, you know, like, it's a wrap for this year, basically. You're the last speaker for this year. So if you wish to stay on the line, do. Otherwise, we'll thank you. And I just wish to talk to people about next year. Sorry to be a bit brief, but I'm aware that, as I say, there might be this blackout in 5 minutes. Sorry to be rude and inhospitality, you know, inhospitable. But thank you, and I'm sure everyone will join me in thanking you. It was a fascinating,
thank you very much. Yes,
very well illustrated talk.
Thank you. No, thank you all for listening to me inviting me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Be quite honest, I couldn't have a better subject to talk about. Thank you very much.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you so much for joining us.
Okay. Merry Christmas, everybody, and let's hope for a better year next year, right?
So, yeah. All right. Thank you, David.
Thanks so much. Thank you.